If we now open shopping-list.js file, which you'll find inside of the JS directory, we're going to start with a use strict to tell our JavaScript engine that obviously we want to use the strict mode. Strict mode, for those who don't know, basically tells JavaScript if there's any problem, if the code isn't written in a proper way, throw the error. That's what it does basically. If we wouldn't be using strict mode, sometimes some problematic code would still succeed proceeding, but with strict mode it just won't work. One thing about Angular JS, in order for our JavaScript file, our Angular application to communicate with our HTML code, which in our case will be index.html, where we've got all of the elements of the page, we need to register the module, and we will register the module using Angular namespace, global namespace, and its function called module. So we start with Angular and then module, and then we specify the name of our application, our module. In our case, I'm just going to use my app. Then we put comma, and after the comma, we specify any dependencies. Now, dependencies in AngularJS are other Angular modules, which you might have created earlier, basically, and you want to use some of its methods inside of this specific module itself. In our case, we only have one module. We aren't going to be using any other modules. There are no dependencies. So what we're going to do is just put an empty array here. After this, we're going to start with the first service. Services in AngularJS are basically functions. You can refer to them like as classes, but think of them as classes. Let's say in PHP you would have separate classes with its own methods. The most common one, there are many different services in Angular, but the most common one, and the one we're going to be using in this tutorial, is called factory. So after the full stop, we type factory, and then the name of this specific service, which will be helper factory. Then comma and function. Inside of this function, basically the function, which is an object, we will return the object, so two curly brackets. And now by returning this object, we have all of its internal methods available within later on when we're going to be creating the controller. We are going to pass this helper factory. We're going to inject it to our controller basically, and we'll have all these methods which we'll create now available inside of this controller. We're going to start with the only method which is actually going to be in this helper factory: filter field array by done, and then colon function, and we're going to have a few parameters here. We have this array, then we have this field, and then this value. You can obviously call them different way, but I tend to use this sort of this and then camel case, whatever item it is. So we have the name of the method and we have everything ready to actually put some code in it. The first thing we're going to create inside of this method is the private variable. So var array to return equals, and it's going to be an empty array to start with. Now we are going to use the for loop, so for, and inside of the brackets we start with the variable I, which will equal 0 by default. Then we go for I needs to be less than this array dot length. Basically it has to be less than the length of this array length, meaning obviously the number of items inside of the array. Then we go for semicolon again, I plus plus, indicating that after each iteration, the I should go +1. Inside of this for loop, we are going to check if this array, and we're checking the specific index, taking the I, which is basically numerical, starts with 0, obviously, then 1, 2, and 3, and so on, depending obviously on how many items we have in this array. So we're taking the specific index and we're checking the item done. And if that equals this value, which is our third argument here, as you can see, if that equals this value, then we want to array to return, we want to push this item to this array, basically adding this to the end of the array. This array, we take in the same index, and then we want the name of the field we want to return. So this field, and then semicolon after this. After the entire for loop, if I scroll up a little bit, few new lines, and then return array to return and semicolon. And that's our factory done.